Let's bring in MS Now White House reporter Jake Traylor, President Emeritus at the Council on Foreign Relations Richard Haass, and Fellow at Princeton Center for International Security Studies Josh Lederman. Jake, what were the biggest takeaways from President's trip to China? Did he come away with anything?
Yeah, Ariel, what we're seeing so far from the president and from President Xi as well is essentially this touting of a relational reset. But when it comes to some of the key political issues we walked into this week expecting to possibly have answers to, there's not a lot of details there. As you mentioned at the top, when it comes to Iran and China's commitment to helping the United States in that area, there was no clear touting of a resolution there. When it comes to certain aspects of trade, Taiwan, this long-going, extensive, delayed U.S. arms sale. The president said he would soon weigh in and make a decision on that, but there was no clear deliverable from their time together. This was kind of the theme of the week. There's a lot of pageantry, a lot of pomp and circumstance, and just about every question that the president was asked about on Air Force One on his way back from Beijing to the United States hours ago, he said that they talked about in extensive detail. The president did not, however, tout any of that detail to reporters. He was asked particularly about China making any level of added commitment to helping the United States in Iran. Take a listen to how he responded to that question.
I'm not asking for any favors, because when you ask for favors, you have to do favors in return. We don't need favors. We've wiped out their armed forces, essentially. We may have to do a little cleanup work because we had a little month-long ceasefire, I guess you'd call it. I mean, President Xi and I agree on many things.
So, Ariel, potentially smoothed over relations between the two nations, which could lead to more predictable trade and markets for the two largest GDPs in the world. But really notably, too, Ariel, the president was asked specifically about the ongoing trade war between the United States and China. The president said that did not come up in their discussions.
Jake Traylor, thank you so much. And Richard, to Jake's point about the relations seeming to be smoothed over after this summit, the relationship between President Trump and Xi Jinping appears to have been strengthened. Can President Trump count that in and of itself a win? How important is their dynamic, that relationship, in the scope of geopolitics right now?
Not a whole lot. It's not a criticism so much as an observation. Almost every American president exaggerates the significance of quote-unquote personal relationships. But it doesn't change things. It doesn't change China's policy on Taiwan. It doesn't mean they're not going to have export-led economic growth. It's an open question whether they're willing to weigh in with Iran. And even if they do, what, if any, difference it would make. So, again, I wouldn't I think it's great that the presidents get together. Hopefully they'll get together again in September. But in and of itself, it's not a whole lot.
Josh, Trump spoke about Taiwan with reporters earlier. Here's what he said.
President Xi said there was a risk of conflict with the U.S. over Taiwan.
No, I don't think so. I think we'll be fine. On Taiwan, he feels very strongly. I made no commitment either way. We'll see what happens.
He made no commitment either way, and Trump appeared to downplay this issue as a whole. What do you make of that?
Well, it was really notable, Ariel, that one of the most striking things that came out of the Chinese side in their traditionally very limited rhetoric and public disclosure about conversations with foreign leaders was towards the beginning of the summit, when there was that one line in the readout of President Xi and President Trump's meeting that was carried in the state-run Xinhua newswire, saying that essentially President Xi had tried to put some boundaries on this relationship, warning the U.S. That Taiwan could really be the issue that could lead the U.S. and China into a type of direct conflict. And so it was fascinating to hear from President Trump that he essentially, in his words, told President Xi in private what he's now saying in public, which is he's not going to talk about whether the U.S. Would defend Taiwan in a crisis, which, of course, has been a longstanding U.S. policy to remain ambiguous about that. But equally important is what he did not do that many China hawks were concerned he might do, which was to either cancel potential military sales to Taiwan under pressure from President Xi, or somehow signal that the U.S. was pulling back from its partnership with Taiwan and signal that the U.S. Definitively would not defend Taiwan. And so the fact that he avoided making those kinds of comments, I think, is going to be reassuring for China hawks.
That is a degree of reassurance. But, Richard, Trump has still not deployed $14 billion in military aid to Taiwan. How are the Chinese reading his signaling on this? Are they sensing that there may be an opening for a change in longstanding U.S. policy here?
I'd say more that they're hoping for it. And I expect they use the meetings with President Trump to get a better read on his policy, not simply on arms sales, but more broadly, whether he's willing and able to come to Taiwan's defense. The fact that we're somewhat bogged down in Iran, we're using up a lot of munitions, is probably good from the Chinese perspective. They learned a little bit about the American way of war watching us in the Middle East. But again, we've had this longstanding policy of ambiguity. China can't discount the possibility we might come to Taiwan's defense. In that sense, I don't think much changed. The Secretary of State was pretty specific that hadn't changed. That China expressed its preferences. It seems to me we heard them out, and life goes on.
And Richard, let's talk about Iran for a moment. Trump says Xi agreed that Tehran should not have a nuclear weapon, which has been a singular fixation of the president, at least in his reasoning for this Iran war. This morning, Iran's foreign minister responded, quote, "Any effort made by the Chinese to support diplomacy will be welcomed by the Islamic Republic of Iran." So I'm curious to know from you, is China now a viable mediator in this situation we find ourselves in Iran? Could their involvement actually move the needle here?
Again, the role of mediators tends to be exaggerated. I say this as one who's mediated a lot of conflicts. China's the biggest buyer of Iranian oil, and China could weigh in and basically tell the Iranians we don't want to see this war resumed or expanded. We'd like to see the Strait open, but at the end of the day, Iran's going to have to make its own decisions. China's still going to need Iranian oil, so the leverage goes both ways. Look, China has not played a helpful role, as best I can tell, when it came to Russia's war against Ukraine. It hasn't played a helpful role most of the time when it came to North Korea. So the idea that they're going to somehow deliver Iran for us seems to me, shall we say, far-fetched.
Josh, is there a risk if China gets involved as a so-called mediator in all of this?
I think the biggest risk for the U.S. is the fact that this is really establishing China as a diplomatic player equal to the U.S. and positioning it as really the potentially most effective international broker in the diplomatic sphere. And I don't think that's going to happen. But certainly if there was one word that defined what China was trying to get out of this whole Xi visit with President Trump in Beijing, it was stability, this idea that we now have two great powers that are essentially on an equal playing field, that are peers. And I think that China seeming to kind of come to the rescue or save the day on Iran would certainly play into that notion of China kind of as a dominant figure on the world stage. And I think that's one reason that the U.S. has been eager, while they want help from China in getting the Strait opened, on putting pressure on Iran, has been more looking towards countries like Pakistan, potentially the Qataris and others, to play any mediating role if, as Richard said, that even is helpful.
A lot of talk of the power dynamics here, the so-called Thucydides trap that Xi Jinping brought up. Josh, President Trump suggested today that he would want to sign some kind of nuclear pact between the U.S., Russia, and China, saying that he got a very positive response from Xi Jinping on this. The last nuclear pact between the U.S. and Russia expires in February. So what would a new agreement mean?
Well, it's really hard to tell if there's any seriousness from President Xi on that, because while the U.S. would certainly like something like that perhaps to happen, the Chinese have been rapidly ramping up their nuclear arsenal from what they used to have essentially a minimal deterrent, just a few hundred nuclear warheads, just so that they had something to keep us from nuking them. And now I believe it's up to about 600, and they have plans to ramp that up to about 1,500, which would put them on par with the U.S. and Russia. And in the past, China said, look, we're not even going to talk about our nuclear arsenal until we've essentially reached parity. Then we can talk. And so it would be a significant departure if they were serious about it. I would suspect that as we go forward, we will hear very little about any serious talk about nuclear disarmament or restrictions between the U.S., Russia, and China.